war and weaponry are as old as human civilization, and as time rolls on, we become more and more innovative in the way we conduct war. But humans who lived long ago had the same creativity and ingenuity we have today. Let's take a look at 15 amazing ancient ranged weapons. Number 15. Bow and arrow. Starting off our list of ancient ranged weapons is the obvious choice, the bow and arrow. And while you still find people using this for sport and hunting all over the world, its roots reach much, much farther back than many people realize. The bow and arrow go all the way back to prehistoric times, like the 61,000-year-old bone arrowheads being found in the Sibudu cave in South Africa. It's safe to say that this ranged weapon is a classic and isn't going anywhere anytime soon. But part of what makes the bow and arrow so unique is that they can be found across all continents and countries. It served as the primary military weapon during the Middle Ages in the Mediterranean and in Europe, and had an even longer tenure in China, Japan, and the Eurasian steppes. It's even found across myths, holy books, creation myths, you name it. It's even an Olympic sport. Bows came in all different shapes and sizes, like the English longbow and the Mongolian horsebow, and shafts could be made of anything from wood to bamboo. The bow and arrow is a classic and versatile ranged weapon, but what makes it so cool is seeing all of the different cultural spins of it. Number 14. Slingshot. When we think of slingshots, we probably think back to the wrist rockets we may have had as kids, shooting rocks at beehives and taking our friends down with water balloons in the summer. But move back in time, way back in time, and the slingshot was a pretty serious ranged weapon. And if someone was really skilled with it, a nicely placed rock to the kneecap will make sure that person never walks again, and a rock to the head could take down even the strongest of opponents. It's morbid, yes, but that's what weapons are for. The most famous depiction of a slingshot used in combat is the biblical story of David and Goliath, where a small and simple shepherd is able to drop the prized warrior and the biggest man on the battlefield. And whether or not the story is true, it makes perfect sense that David, the shepherd, would be highly skilled with the slingshot. At the time, it was common for shepherds to use something as simple and accessible as a slingshot to protect their livestock from things like wolves and lions. Slinging a rock at one beast will have the rest of the pack heading for the hills, so think about that the next time you're gift wrapping a slingshot for your niece's and nephew's birthday present. Number 13. Atlatl. Anyone can throw a spear, but not everyone can do it well. And even then, the human body still has its limits. That's where the atlatl comes in. If a weapon is an extension of the human body, then the atlatl is an extension of that extension. Well, that makes sense, right? Well, maybe. The atlatl is more commonly known as a spear thrower. Dating back to about 2000 BC, the atlatl is a stick or a board with a hook at the end that works just like a slingshot, except this thing is throwing small spears instead of rocks, making it much more devastating to be on the receiving end of. The spears are made from wood and have a little wobble to them, which creates a springing effect in the air that increases its velocity once it's been thrown. Of course, the best atlatl users have gone through some extensive training, but once you get it down, the atlatl is adding some serious speed and distance to the small spear. Today, atlatl clubs and leagues exist, and members can compete in competitions or even use them to hunt game. This fierce ranged weapon, which was fearsome on the battlefield, can now be bought online easily. Number 12. Bola. If you ever watched some old Batman cartoons, then you might just be familiar with the next entry on this list. The bola is pretty similar to the slingshot, but instead of throwing rocks at your target, the bola itself is the projectile. And instead of aiming it at their head, you're throwing it at their legs. The bola is going to have 3 weights at the end of the string that wraps themselves around the prey's legs, entangling them until you decide to let them go. Think back to the AT-ATs in Empire Strikes Back, only this time it's real. And the weights at the end of the bola are going to let it fly nice and far. And while it was primarily used in hunting animals, the bola isn't really the type of thing you'd want to be thrown at you, either because if it doesn't wrap around your legs, those weights are still going to do a number on you. But as always, the bola takes years of practice to become proficient in. But part of its staying power is just how simple it is to make. If you've got a rope and some big rocks, then you're just about ready to go. Number 11. Blowgun. An oldie but a goodie. Most experts can agree that the blowgun, although reimagined and redesigned throughout history, dates back to prehistoric times. The blowgun may be a primitive ranged weapon, but it's still deadly nonetheless. typically fashioned out of bamboo or reed. All you have to do is load your dart of choice into the tube, let out a quick puff of air, and let it rip. And the stronger your respiratory muscles are, the longer the dart will travel, and the harder it's going to hit. So it takes a lot of practice to be a top marksman. But even so, you're not just loading up any old dart. No way. A good blowgun hunter or warrior is going to dip the tip in poison, paralyzing the target or letting them die nice and slow. It's not the most effective ranged weapon for combat, which is why you've never heard of a battalion of blowgun users. But one-on-one, this thing is pretty deadly and pretty amazing. The blowgun is still used by indigenous tribes around the world to help put food on the table night after night. Number 10. Amentum. Thinking back to the Atlatl, this is the next step in its evolution. While the Atlatl threw small spears that were more akin to an arrow shaft, the Amentum threw javelins, big javelins, and they excelled during the Bronze and Iron Ages. The Amentum had a much more simple design though, as it was just a leather strap wrapped around the javelin and then slipped over the wielder's fingers. The straps caused the javelin to spin, making it travel farther, faster, and with much more stability. Think of it like a big bullet firing from the barrel of a gun. The Amentum gave your spinning javelin a range of about 80 meters and offered a much more lightweight alternative to the Atlatl, and the overall designs of the javelin made them more effective than throwing spears. And while the javelin that accompanied the leather Amentum was typically a ranged weapon, it also doubled as a melee weapon for when the enemy came in a little too close for comfort. But until then, the idea of a spinning, iron-tipped spear being hurled at you is a pretty horrifying concept. Number 9. Plumbata, lead darts. If you've ever excelled at darts in a bar, then this next amazing ancient ranged weapon just might be the one for you. Plumbata is Latin for lead-weighted, so you can imagine what a Plumbata lead dart is. This little sucker is heavy and the iron head is barbed to boot. So if one of them comes falling towards your head on the battlefield, you better move. And on the other side of the heavy lead head is fletching, which allows the soldier not just a good grip, but a little bit of stability once it's airborne. But Plumbata could be as small as a hand length and large as a forearm length, and instead of being loaded into a blowgun, this bad boy is thrown underhand. Because of the weighted tip, you can be sure that it's always going to land head first onto the target, and it was usually thrown with enough force to puncture shields and armor. And if it does manage to get to the skin, which it usually did, the barbs are going to make sure you're not pulling it out without taking some meat with it. And the lead won't help you down the road either. Plus, the small size made the Plumbata easy enough for soldiers to carry on their belts or in the hollows of their shields. Lobbing a ranged weapon through the air may seem a little lame, but when an entire infantry is throwing them across the battlefield, you'll quickly realize that getting hit by one is pretty lame too. Number 8. Francisca bouncing axes. The Frank tribes of Europe predate the Germanic tribes of the Angles and the Saxons and are often forgotten in history. But their Francisca bouncing axes are definitely well remembered. These nasty little axes had a long arch and a wooden handle that made them a little clunky and a little less practical to use as a melee weapon. But that's quickly remedied when you throw them. In fact, they were designed just for that. Generally speaking, the Francisca is an inaccurate weapon. They spin in the air without any real predictability. But that's where the bouncing comes in. Because if a Francisca hits the ground in front of the target, well, it's going to bounce right up and into their chest. You don't get off easy with these things. And even if a soldier is hit with the hilt, it can make for a pretty nasty and bone-breaking sight. But the unpredictability of the Francisca works to the user's advantage. The chaotic path of the axe can quickly break ranks when a few hundred are being thrown at once. They were also used as a secondary weapon by infantry. So once these are thrown, your main focus is to not get hit by one. But then you won't even notice the enemy running at you. Francisca makes for one rough day. Number 7. Crossbow. Taking the idea of the bow and arrow and giving it an upgrade is the crossbow. And while the crossbow consists of a short bow and a much smaller bolt, meaning it has less range, approaching a wall of crossbowmen is not something you want to do. That thing is flying straight and fast enough to pierce armor. They were essentially the guns of the medieval period, with a range of about 1,000 feet. While the English longbows were a force to be reckoned with, you still needed extensive training to be lethal. Anybody and everybody could wield a crossbow. It required hardly any skill, but it was just as deadly. Even after firearms were introduced, the crossbow still reigned supreme as the handheld ranged weapon. At the time, the crossbow was slightly easier to reload than a musket, was smaller, and the ammunition wasn't as bulky, so you could have plenty of bolts on you at any given time. The fact that the crossbow are still used to hunt game today is a testament to their staying power. Number 6. Hand cannon. Also appropriately known as the handgun. The hand cannon dates all the way back to the 12th century in Chinese rock sculptures, and the name should say it all. It was the first true firearm and changed the way wars were fought forever. The hand cannon is pretty simple in theory and design. It just took the idea of a cannon and toned it down a bit so that it could rest on the shoulder of one of the soldiers. They were smaller and cheaper than their larger cousins, and easier to produce as well. So now instead of lugging around a few cannons and ammunition, 100 soldiers could carry one on their shoulders so that it's easier to fire and reload, even if it's firing one shot at a time. Make no mistake though, the hand cannon wasn't firing long distances, and wasn't very accurate either. But if you're aiming at a legion of enemy combatants, it really doesn't matter who you're aiming at. Someone is bound to get hit, and the iron pellet will easily rip through their armor and give them a wound that will take them out of battle for good. Number 5. Trebuchet. If you've ever played a real-time strategy game in a medieval setting, then you'll be plenty familiar with the number 5 spot on our list. We are, of course, talking about the trebuchet. The trebuchet dates back as far as the 6th century and uses a long arm and counterweight to hurl objects thousands of feet away. It was the siege weapon of choice until the advent of gunpowder, and it's easy to see why. A group of trebuchets is a great way to pummel an enemy castle while your allies remain at a safe distance. Because this siege engine was so heavy, they were typically built right on site. Once it was set up, there was absolutely no defense against them. The best course of action is to fight on the ground they stand on in hopes of dismantling it, which also means charging straight into an enemy encampment. Good luck. Number 4. Spring bow. Another serious ranged medieval hazard is the invention of the spring bow. The name says it all. It's a spring-loaded bow that acts as a trap and shoots its unsuspecting victim with an arrow. But what makes this so scary? Well, it could be used just about anywhere and in any way. One such instance occurred in the 10th century Scotland when King Kenneth II was tricked into moving a statue that was loaded with plenty of spring bows that let loose, shooting him dead on sight. In another story of the spring bow, King Edmund Ironside of England fell victim to one while on the privy. That's medieval lingo for a toilet. So, the late maybe not so great King Edmund went to relieve himself with a hidden string attached to the seat of his privy or toilet. The spring bow shot straight up when he sat down. Yikes. Number 3. Grapeshot. While the 18th century may not be considered ancient, any of the weaponry of yore has either been upgraded or simply lost in the annals of time. One such ranged weapon is the grapeshot. True to its name, grapeshot consists of small balls, typically made of iron and lead, held together in a cluster that was shot from a cannon. This was mainly used as anti-personnel ammunition and proved to be pretty nasty on the battlefield. Think of it as a cannon mixed with a shotgun. And the more balls or pellet that were in a cluster, the worse off the enemy was. It wasn't uncommon for the balls to be held together by iron rings, and then to be as tall as 3 tiers before being loaded into the cannon. If you wanted to get really nasty, engineers could add chain links and nails. Grapeshot is the type of ranged weapon that'll take everyone on the front lines out quickly. Number 2. Greek fire. Fire on its own can be a scary natural event, but the medieval Greeks were able to harness the power of nature and take it to the next level with what is now known as Greek fire. What made this invention so frightening was that it was created using chemical compounds that prevent the fire from being extinguished. Coupled with the fact that the thick substance can stick to walls, flesh, and even burn on water, it made for a formidable and foreboding sight on the battlefield. More commonly, the Greek fire was put in glass jars and hurled at enemies. It was also known to be used with a hose, allowing for it to reach even further distances. A more famous instance when Greek fire was used against other humans was during the defense of Constantinople against an Arab fleet, setting their ships ablaze before ever making it to shore. Number 1. The nest of bees. Scared of bees? Well, then this next invention from medieval China may be one to steer clear of. And although there aren't any actual bees involved, the nest of bees still packs quite a nasty sting. Most likely invented in around the 11th century, this was a long hexagonal tube filled with dozens of rocket-tipped arrows. The opening of the tube was broad, allowing for the rocket arrows to disperse once it opened. Invented shortly after gunpowder, this was one experiment you do not want to be on the receiving end of. Close to 30 arrows were shot at once across the battlefield, and if the impact or blood loss didn't kill the enemy, then the poison and flaming tips did. And because they were so small and simple, thousands could be deployed against an advancing enemy at once. Adding to the fear of being stung by one of the bees, they buzzed and howled as they flew through the air and left a thick trail of smoke in its wake. The nest of bees is scary as it is cruel. Watch our binge-watching playlist if you'd like to watch all of our most popular top 15 videos. Grab a drink, grab a snack, and get ready to binge.